Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast, topic edition, longer edition, Monday edition, whatever you want to call it. And today we're going to be talking about the time. Why are we talking about the time, Paddy? And how are you this week?
First of all, I am absolutely, positively fantastic. Going out of my mind, not being allowed out of my house.
It's pretty weak, but okay.
See, humans are actually social animals that are not meant to be caged. You might be a lesser form of human, but the rest of us, we actually like engaging with other human beings, being social and being outside, you know. But anyway, look, I digress. We already knew you were subhuman. But anyway, so the time. Today's episode, we're continuing this nutrition series, and we're talking about the temporal dimension of food, if you will, right? And what I mean by that is we're talking about the timing of your food intake, because this is something that people either fall on two ends of the spectrum, and like most things, the answer is, in the middle. And what I mean by that is some people will say food timing does not matter at all. It literally does not matter, right? And there are arguments and points to that argument that are completely correct, right? And then there are also those individuals that say, oh, food timing is everything. If you are even off by 30 seconds, you fucked it. You might as well give up, and you see this debate, you used to see this debate a lot more. I think the evidence-based crowd, whatever you want to call them, did shift the conversation to a good point. But like most things, like when you do that, the pendulum just swings wildly, and they kind of shifted the conversation to the point where they were like, yeah, it doesn't matter at all, and that doesn't really help most individuals, because most individuals are clearly aware that food timing does matter to some extent, right? Because if it didn't, you just eat one meal per day and never feel hungry, never feel lower in energy. You get great body composition changes, all the beneficial stuff from the diet, but that's just not the case for most individuals, right? So in this episode, we're going to just talk it through a little bit more about the time dimension to food. Then we're also going to touch on the topic of kind of intermittent fasting, because that I think if we explain the time dimension to food, and then we put it in a more practical setting of, like, say, intermittent fasting, that also answers a few questions that some people may have, and it obviously puts it in a more practical kind of setting itself. And then we're going to touch on, just at the end, the topic of chrononutrition, which is basically what we're talking about, but also different if you're actually talking about like a research setting, right? So that's the kind of flow of this episode, or at least what we hope to cover in this episode. So Gary, obviously, again, we've discussed that there's this swing, this pendulum back and forth, but the crux of the issue is there, or do we need to time our food intake? And I want to touch on this from like two perspectives, from the calorie perspective and then a protein perspective, because those two things, we cover those two, like I think you get a better understanding of the interplay going on itself. Now, I don't want to go in this episode, I don't want this to be kind of descended into a discussion of like AMP and AMPK and mTOR, because we could do that. It's not exactly well, first of all, this medium is not exactly the best way to convey those messages. Like, you need to see stuff, you need to have a little bit more explanation, a little bit more in depth, and just talking through it doesn't really fit. The medium isn't right to do that. We have articles on site about that are better to describe that. But just from a calorie perspective, Gary, do we need to time our calories? Like, what's the story there? Like, does it even matter? Like, are the people that are saying, food timing doesn't matter at all, are they right? Or are the people that are saying you need to eat 6 meals per day, you need to be eating every 2 hours, you need to have a post-workout meal, or else, you literally the workout was irrelevant, Who's right? Where do we fall on this kind of spectrum?
Yeah, so I want to start by making a kind of a general point or a meta point in line with what you said. And what you said was that in relation to that pendulum swing, because as much as people in the evidence-based community like to, say that they're not dogmatic and that, we're critical thinkers, etc., very often you can consider yourself to be evidence-based and still be just as dogmatic. And like I know you listen to Eric Weinstein as well. And one of the things that he says is like, anytime Trump says something, for example, Donaldo, the Donnie, you can't just put a negative sign in front of it and expect to be correct. And that's what a lot of people do when they see something that maybe they disagree with what Trump says or something like that. Because he's a particularly good example that actually translates really well here, because Trump could say something that's actually really, really correct and like would actually be supported by evidence. And the same people who would be critical all the time will just put a negative sign in front of it and try to knock down anything that he says, which basically makes you're not a critical thinker in that case. You just maybe happen to be right when Trump is wrong, and you try to make those examples really clear. So that happens here in the evidence-based community as well, where when people, like, for example, when you talk about fasting, for example, fasting and rigid meal timing from bodybuilding circles would be good examples of this. So you've kind of got the health side of things, where you've got gurus who say that fasting can fix everything and it's going to prolong your life, etc. In the bodybuilding sphere, you've got people who say meal timing is everything. It's really important that you nail your protein right away the second after your workout. Intermeal amino acids and things like that. And as a result, the people in the evidence-based community sometimes just want to put that negative sign in front of that to combat it at all costs. And we can end up being just as incorrect in that case, because to say that fasting has no utility and it's 100% just the same as continuous caloric restriction, you don't have evidence to support that point either, and that's not a fair conclusion. Similarly, if you were to turn around and say that meal timing doesn't matter at all and you just have to hit your calories, that is also incorrect. And from my perspective, you are no different than the person who's being militant or rigid about, meal timing be the most important thing in the world. Okay. So recognize that thinking critically about this stuff and being scientific does not just mean opposing things that seem to be incorrect at all costs. You have to try and find, okay, where is the truth? So that brings us now on to that discussion of like, where does timing actually matter? So like, this answer does vary depending on whether you're talking about health, performance, or body composition. There are some differences there. And I think for most people, we can kind of hit a nice middle ground between all of those variables for most of our audience. So most of our audience listening to this, whether you're a personal trainer or you're just an individual trying to improve your own health, performance, or body composition, the nutrition guidelines that suit most of your needs are going to take care of your health, your performance, and your body composition. Okay, so like, you don't need to take a huge trade-off in any one of those areas. And from my perspective, when I think about what guidelines do I want people to kind of take on board, most of the time we're talking about trying to distribute protein intake across the day. Okay, and like, a lot of the time people will illustrate this by trying to give extreme examples. So if you admit that, let's say, having all of your protein for 2 weeks in one meal every 2 weeks, if you admit that that's not necessarily optimal, then there has to be some point at which we accept the timing is actually important. Okay, so is it once a week? Is it once a day? Is it a couple of times per day? And I think if you're to actually look at the research, the outcome that would seem to be, pretty sound is having multiple protein feedings per day, with the importance of that increasing in your hierarchy the more you're worried about muscle building or strength. Okay, so if they're the outcomes you're really trying to chase, I'd be looking for at least 3 protein feedings per day. Okay, we're not going to be talking about protein targets in this episode. Go back to the previous episodes. But in terms of timing, I think 3 feedings per day is probably pretty sound. Maybe a little bit more depending on how serious you're taking your goals. But that's going to
just on that, like, it's actually, again, you can go back, if you just understand, like, say, we'll call it the physiology or the biochemistry of it. Like, this is actually technically incorrect, but there's no way for your body to store amino acids. right? Like the way your body stores carbohydrates, the way your body stores fats, like there's a mechanism to store those, right? That's what we call them, the energy substrates, if you will. Like they're basically like, here's your energy substrate. We can store it in a battery somewhere in the body, either as like muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, or as like fatty acids, triglycerides, actually like packed away in an adipocyte, right? But with protein, like amino acids, is broken down. It's like they don't get stored anywhere. Now, that's not actually technically correct. Like they do actually get transiently stored in like I believe it's called the splenic area, which is basically just your abdomen, like around your internal organs. They basically just are around there. That's kind of controversial to an extent. Like that's not fully elucidated what's going on there, but there is some transient storage. But the main way you store amino acids is in your muscles, right? Like that's your store of a protein, right? So if you look at how fast you can build muscle, then that's how fast you can store protein, right? Or store amino acids. So if you can't store this nutrient that you're eating, that means that you have to eat it more frequently if it's needed in the body, right? And obviously, again, there's a load of signaling processes like we touched on, like the mTOR stuff, that maybe would influence us if we, like Gary said, are more interested in muscle building itself, But from a very practical perspective, if we just look at it and go, 3 to 4 protein feedings per day seems to get the majority of the population. That seems to work for the majority of people, regardless of size, regardless of goals, regardless of whatever. If we just get 3 to 4 protein servings per day, we could say there's a minimum threshold for each of those servings, and that's fine. Like, maybe we go, oh, we want to have 3 to 5 grams of leucine on each of those servings. Like, we can get into really nitty gritty with this stuff, but if you just go, I'm going to have 3 to 4 servings of protein per day, you're pretty good to go. Now, again, with that, you probably do want to space them out a bit more, like saying, oh, I want to have 3 servings of protein per day and eating it at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., and 7 p.m. Like that's obviously not the exact same as eating it at 7 a.m., 1 p.m., and I don't know, 7 p.m. Like obviously they're completely different things. But again, if you just take a step back and actually understand the biochemistry, the digestion, the physiology, if you want to call it that, of what's going on, then you can make more informed choices. However, you don't need to go that far back to just realize, like, even at a practical perspective, if you're like, okay, protein helps with the muscle building process, protein helps with the recovery process, protein helps with all of these health related processes, and I can't store it, oh, it's probably a good idea if I'm eating to eat some protein, right? And again, practically speaking, most people are eating 3 to 4 times per day. So just from a very practical perspective, just putting a section of protein at each meal just makes sense. And you just so happen to get a good distribution of that protein timing throughout the day then.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like people do kind of like to reduce it to these real simple messages, which is important from a like delivering the information perspective. Like that is important, that we don't start talking about individual amino acids and stuff. But it's always important to know that there's a lot more going on, under the hood, as in like even the difference between like what initially triggers muscle protein synthesis and then having the building blocks available. Like that varies between different protein types, like not all protein types are going to lead to the exact same response. But as you begin to micromanage that stuff, it just becomes impractical. So that's why basically these rules of thumb can be pretty sound. And the other thing to note with that is that your response to a given nutrient varies depending on whether or not you've been active. It depends on what the meal was previously. So for example, if in your context, you said if you were to eat your protein at 5, 6, and 7 p.m., you're not going to get the same response to that protein feeding at 6 p.m. as you did to the one at 5 p.m. So there's different responses depending on what you've eaten previously, your energy status, your whether or not you've been exercising, etc. So there's definitely a lot more to it than just like calories and macro totals. But the point is that you get most of your things sorted by having very simple rules of thumb. So for the most part, that kind of at least 3 protein feedings is probably a pretty sound thing to aim for. Now, with that said, but that's primarily when you're thinking about someone who's into, right, I'm doing my hypertrophy and strength training. Like, does that matter all that much for general health? Like, is there going to be a massive uptake in your fat loss outcomes or anything like that versus having your protein at one meal? Like, probably not. Like, you could make the case, but I think it's a little bit less of a priority. So overall, that's going to be more of a priority the more you're concerned with your actual muscle mass. Personally, like, you're going to chime in, just give me 1 second. Personally, I eat probably like I spread my protein across 2 to 3 meals most of the time. Okay, maybe 4 sometimes, but very rarely anymore. I would probably bump that up a little bit if muscle building was more of a priority than it is for me. But for me, I'm always thinking about what's easiest from an adherence perspective. What do I enjoy most? What allows me to, cook nice food and things like that, or have the meals that I enjoy without having to constantly think about, all right, it's just the protein I'm thinking about. So you do have to consider where that fits in with your priorities, because if you're someone that just really enjoys the culinary experience, you enjoy cooking really nice meals for yourself that are a bit more calorie dense, then it actually just might suit you to have 2 meals per day versus 3. And if you were trying to increase your capacity for muscle building, maybe you'd add an extra shake to fill in the third protein serving, but maybe you wouldn't, and you just accept that, right, I'm getting the vast majority of my results by hitting my overall protein intake, spreading it out a little bit, and I don't need to sweat the details,
Yeah, and
Agree with
obviously
it.
it has to be, noted that Gary is in fact 180 kilos of lean mass. So obviously
Yes.
he's not interested in, getting bigger. So that has to be factored in. No, but seriously, yeah, this also, I didn't think we'd touch on it here, but I thought we'd get to it later, but this also goes to the topic that this is something that's really hard when you're reading research or you're trying to interpret a message that someone's putting out, because effectively something you say to someone who is tracking, like actively tracking their nutrition, their calories, their macronutrients, all that kind of stuff, versus something you say to someone who is not actively tracking that, but still trying to look after their diet, that can be two completely different messages. For example, like protein intake helps with satiety, right? So you feel fuller for longer. Now, if you've never tracked your calories before, you have no idea how to, evaluate the caloric load of the meal in front of you, then having some protein with that meal is probably a good idea just from a practical perspective, because it keeps you fuller for longer. So your next meal is then probably going to be a little bit, smaller as a result, So for, like Gary was saying, for like your general population, probably doesn't matter a huge amount if you have like, I need to have like exactly 3 to 5 grams of leucine at each meal, like that probably doesn't, matter too much to your fucking nan down the road, who's like, oh, I just want to be healthy until I'm 90 or whatever, and it probably doesn't matter a huge amount. However, it does matter from the perspective of, having some protein at that meal is probably going to keep them fuller for a little bit longer, maybe keeps their energy levels a little bit higher. So, they might do a bit more activity day to day then, their steps might be higher, whatever it is. And they're able to eat at a calorie appropriate level for their output, because they're not, ravenously hungry. They're not, excuse me, the coronavirus getting me. They're not ravenously hungry come like 10 o'clock and eating 30 biscuits, and then being like, oh, not really hungry for lunch. I'm not going to have a real meal for lunch. And it kind of starts off this cascade, whereas if they'd had some protein for breakfast, then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm actually better able to stick to my calories. However, if you're tracking your calories, you're actively tracking your calories, your macronutrients, you're using something like MyFitnessPal, that's just not an issue that you think of. You're just like, all right, if I'm going to eat some biscuits, I'll just include them in my tracking, and while, yeah, we can argue that it's not optimal and maybe you are going to feel hungrier later in the day or whatever, if you are not tracking, you're not actively tracking your calories, like not having protein at a meal can actually be the difference between being on track with your calorie needs versus not being on track, So effectively, like when we're discussing the timing aspect of things, and this will become more apparent when we actually do discuss like chrononutrition, you have to really distinguish between who are we talking about? What's the population? Are we talking about someone who is actively tracking their calories, or are we talking about someone who is free living? They're not tracking their calories. Maybe they are trying to improve their diet, but they're not actively in the process of like logging everything that they eat, because the advice then potentially changes. Because if I say eat some protein with all of your meals, because it's going to keep you fuller for longer between each of those meals, and as a result reduce your overall calorie intake throughout the day because you're not snacking in between meals, then that could be the simplest a protocol that you bring in to actually get results with someone who is, not really tracking their calories. However, it's a hard one to fully, tease out all of the little minutia of it. But with that said, I probably would just, even for your fucking nan down the road, be like, yeah, it's probably a good idea to have protein with all of your meals. Do you need to sweat it and be like, oh, there's only 2 grams of leucine in this protein feeding, you need to bang that right up? I probably wouldn't sweat it that much. However, I would probably still put an emphasis on having some protein at each of your meals, and like Gary said, that can be, we'll say, 3 main meals per day, where you're like, all right, I'm going to try and make sure that my main meals of the day, which for most people, at least in our kind of Western culture, you have like a breakfast, a lunch, a dinner, so having some protein feeding at all of those, and it doesn't need to be a huge, like when people think of a protein feeding, maybe they're thinking of like, I don't know, 200, 300 grams of chicken or ham or beef or something. Like, it doesn't need to be that at each of your meals, but like something like 15, 30 to maybe even up to 50 grams of protein spread on each of those meals, it gets you up to your target that little bit easier. And that can look like a variety of different things. Like, I know people have a very hard time thinking of like protein sources for breakfast, but there are actually so many. Like, you've got eggs, you've got milk, you've got like yogurt. Like, there's a variety of things that we would eat as traditional breakfast foods that are actually high in protein. Like, I always say it, just half trolling but also completely serious. Like, whey and oats is a traditional Irish meal, right? And everyone always goes on like, oh yeah, this is a new thing where I'm like, I'm adding my protein to my oats, and I'm like, this is exactly, this is the new fit fam thing. But that is an old Irish recipe, because when you're separating your curds and your whey, like they're not going to throw out that way. Like, right, currently, we use it for like industry, where like the protein industry, or feed it to the pigs or something like that. You want to recycle that nitrogen. Like the old Irish used to do it, they just used to put it in their oats, so that is an old Irish recipe, and that is the way you would get protein feeding in the morning. So like, there are ways to go about it. It's not some revolutionary thing. Or again, like I always say it as well, like Tipper's traditional Irish breakfast, like, again, you're getting your protein feeding in the morning, so there are ways to go about it to spread your protein intake throughout the day. And unfortunately, a lot of people just weren't raised, they weren't raised proper, Gary. They weren't raised with protein feeding spread throughout the day. So it can be something very new to them, even though it's not new to the human experience.
Yeah, like that conversation about protein feedings in the morning is definitely something I have with a lot of clients, because they just kind of freak out about it, not realizing that like it doesn't mean you have to have a big steak. It doesn't even mean you have to have a couple of scoops of whey. Like, it can be as simple, like you said. Oats, I think, are 14 grams of protein per 100 grams, something like that. Like, that's a good bit of protein, and obviously, like, maybe the amino acid profile isn't perfect, but you supplement that 100 grams of oats with 200 milliliters of milk. You probably add another, what's milk, like 5 grams protein per 100, something like that. You're up to 24 grams of protein, bit of peanut butter on top. And granted, like, that might be too many calories for some people, but bit of peanut butter on top, another few grams, and you're up around your kind of 30 grams of protein serving, like, sorted, before you ever consider, like, do I need to add whey? Do I need to add yogurt? Like, yogurt is another perfect example. So yeah, it is doable to get these protein sources. And I think you brought up a really important point there that I was very keen to make in this episode. In general, it's more important when we talk about fasting. And that is that we can't start every conversation with the qualifier that, oh yeah, it just doesn't matter once you're tracking your calories, because that's not an assumption that you go into every conversation with. Like, for example, I don't track my calories. For the last 2.5, 3 years, I've probably haven't tracked my calories for more than a few weeks at a time, maybe.
I'm coming on 2,000 days of continuous tracking, because how neurotic I am.
So when I make my nutrition decisions, they're not based on like solely, all right, well, it doesn't matter because I track my calories. They're based on, right, what suits my schedule, what's likely to lead me to eat an appropriate amount of calories, whether that's more or whether that's less. And and what's likely to keep me full. How do I, enjoy my meals and still hit those calorie targets, etc. And that varies over time. Like, when I was when we were in college, and I was, training in the gym and training in jiu-jitsu and cycling to and from college and getting lots of steps and stuff, like my main consideration was, all right, how can I make sure that I actually get enough calories to fuel all of this? Okay. So the way that I was making decisions was in line with how can I basically leverage the when I'm hungriest, to try and eat the most calories. And then, like right now, when I'm a little bit less active, we're stuck at home, trying to pull off a little bit of body fat, my decisions are based more on, okay, how can I go the opposite direction and eat a diet that leads me to eating less calories spontaneously without having to think too much about it. Okay, so when we are coming into these conversations and we're thinking about food timing and stuff like that, you do have to remember that other people don't track calories, and that it's a good idea, even from an adherence perspective, while tracking calories, to do the things that support someone's satiety, their general routine, and overall adherence, and that we can't just conclude every conversation with, oh yeah, it just doesn't matter, just track your calories. Okay. So that does come into a lot of dietary discussions in general. Like, for example, if you look at some nutrition studies, what you might see is that, oh, there was no difference between, let's say, a low carbohydrate and a low fat diet. There was no difference. Both work the exact same for weight loss. And that's a fine kind of research conclusion, but it's not necessarily a conclusion that's an appropriate conclusion for a nutritionist or a personal trainer or someone who's trying to help an individual. Because what you have to realize is that on that spectrum of responses on either a low fat or a low carbohydrate diet, or it could be a fasting diet versus continuous energy restriction, there's a spectrum of responses there, and your client is somewhere on that spectrum and you don't initially know where that is. So you could come into it, with your evidence-based cap on and think, oh yeah, the diet, the macronutrients, but does not matter for you once you hit your calories. But it might actually be the case that one of your clients is actually someone who does much better on a lower carbohydrate diet. Or it might be the case that one of your clients does much better on a lower fat diet. So you do have to keep that stuff open. And the same can be said for meal timing in this discussion. So in terms of protein, that's that squared away. Overall calories, in terms of like distributing them throughout the day, basically they're going to follow your protein intake. Like, that's the way I look at it. If you're having 3 meals per day to get in your protein, your calories are, for the most part, going to be relatively evenly distributed across that. However, like, that's not necessarily always the case. So if someone is training, for example, it might be the case that they want to have more energy around the training window. And that's definitely something I do advise for a lot of my clients, that they kind of, spread their, especially if you're in a deficit and you find that energy is a problem, putting energy, more of your energy, your daily energy intake around that peri-workout window can be useful. And typically, like in the real world, that does kind of work a little bit better with a 4-meal structure. Like for at least for a lot of people I find that are more athletic and they have a higher calorie intake and they're more concerned about performance, I kind of nudge from that 3-meal structure, the basic 3-meal structure that I would follow most of the time, to a 4-meal structure. The reason for that being, if someone, let's say, has their breakfast at 8 a.m., they have their lunch at 12 or 1, and they're training at 6, then the gap between that 1 o'clock feeding and the training at 6 is quite large for me to say that, oh, will we put dinner before and not eat after, or put dinner after and not eat before? So you'd actually be better off in that context to have a meal maybe 1 to 3 hours before and, pretty much as soon as after, because you're not going to say, oh, eat 3 hours after 8 p.m. and then you're going to bed. Um, so yeah, the energy distribution does matter from a fueling perspective, from an adherence perspective. And yeah, that would be my basic summary for athletic individuals. Maybe consider distributing across or around the workout window. For most people, you can distribute it relatively evenly. There might be benefits to having more of your energy earlier in the day, which we will get onto. But again, that does depend on the individual, because while that may be the case for let's say general health in the general population, if someone is training at 6 p.m. and they're in a deficit and I know that they need to be well fueled, my priority is getting that energy intake around the workout window, as opposed to saying, oh no, let's not eat too much at night, because sports nutrition and general health nutrition, while there's lots of crossover, not always the same.
Yeah, like again, we have to talk about the actual population, like who was
Yeah.
the advice, who are listening to this. Like, I'm going to give a few examples here. Like, for a general population person who is maybe, we'll say just very sedentary individual, right? In that case, you can just eat your calories whenever. It literally doesn't matter, right? And I know we were saying, like, saying it doesn't matter is kind of short-sighted, and it's not like a great heuristic to use, but it kind of doesn't matter. Eat to your preference. Like, do you like bigger breakfasts? Do you like bigger lunches? Do you like bigger dinners? What meal distribution allows you to more accurately stay to a calorie load that is appropriate for your level of activity, and whatever it is, find it out. Maybe that is a small breakfast, a small lunch, and a bigger dinner. That's fine. Do whatever you need to do to stay on track with your calories, right? And again, we'll touch more on that again in the fasting and stuff, right? But if you layer in some activity into that, so again, that could be you're just an active individual day to day, like you have a very manual labor intensive job. Maybe you're a builder, you're a bricklayer, something like that. You're like, I'm literally burning through calories like nobody's business. Then you probably do need to have a bit more of an even spread of your calories. Like, you need to have a good breakfast, you need to have a good lunch, you need to have a good dinner, just because it's like, well, I burned through so many calories just doing my day-to-day activity that this is something that I need to prioritize. And this is where a lot of we'll call them like wholesome meals came from. Or like I traveled through America. Like, I literally drove all over America last summer, and like, obviously I like eating food. So you're trying out, like, we'll call them traditional breakfasts and stuff, and like the way they are set up is to fuel, like, say you're a rancher or something, like, it's to set up to fuel that individual. That breakfast is huge because someone's eating that at 5 6 a.m, whatever it is, because they're going for a day out on the fucking ranch, so they need to have a huge breakfast to fuel that activity, because they're only going to bring like a sandwich with them or fucking some jerky or something, so their lunch is going to be small, but then they come back for dinner, and the dinner is big then again, because they're like, I'm fueling before my day's activity, which is whatever fucking 12 hours of farm labor, and then they're like, all right, I'm going to have a big dinner when I come back as well, so I only need to have a small lunch as a result, so that's they've organized their nutrition in a way that fits their lifestyle, and again, that's what an individual needs to do. Now, when we layer on something like activity, just day-to-day life, again, you need to do the same thing. If we layer on the activity specific to, say, organized exercise like resistance training or something like that, it's really like, people put a lot of stock into this, be like, oh, like, you need to have your sports nutrition, you need to have, like, 2 hours before, you need to have X many calories, X many carbohydrates, you need to hydrate exactly this much. And well, yeah, all of that stuff is important, like, there's no denying that you can inch out small improvements in performance and stuff by really micromanaging your nutrition and stuff. And 100%, if you are an athlete, or you're trying to get as big as you humanly possibly can, or get as shredded as you humanly can, or whatever the goal is, you're getting as strong as you possibly can, as fit as you, whatever it is, right? Whatever performance metric, or even body composition metric that you're aiming for, if you are trying to be the absolute pinnacle of that, then yeah, 100%. Why wouldn't you try to inch out that little, 0.5% that you might get from, timing your food exactly, right? However, for most people, it just doesn't matter that much outside of, feeling good when you train and feeling recovered after you train, so portioning your calories around your workout does make sense from that perspective. Maybe having something like, again, 2 to 3 hours, we'll say 1 to 3 hours before exercise. You might even have some intra-workout nutrition if your calories are high, or again, depending on the activity, and then you have something afterwards to, again, refuel all whatever you've burned through during that workout, right? So they're the two general ones that you'll see. However, there is another one as well, which I fall into, and you do fall into some days, and that is the double day athlete. And what I mean by that is, you're doing, say, resistance training earlier in the day, and then you're doing your sport later in the day. Because I know we have a lot of GA athletes that listen to this, and I know the two of us do like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so it is different. But even with that perspective, I'll just use myself as a perspective. Like I do resistance training, 4 days per week, and I do that in the middle of the day. We'll say 12 o'clock, just random time there. That's roughly the time anyway. Do that at 12 o'clock. And then in the evening, 4 days per week, I have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? So for me, portioning out my calories does become more important, because not only do I have to be fueled for the first session of the day, I have to be refueled by the second session of the day, right? So portioning out your calories, distributing your calories does become more important in that case, and there's multiple ways that you can organize that. But all you really have to think of it conceptually is, I want to be fueled for both of those sessions, right? So that probably means that you should be prioritizing refueling after that first session. Like that should become a bigger priority. And this is where stuff like, a post-workout shake, like even with like sugar type stuff, some sort of glucose solution type stuff, and whey immediately after your workout, that probably does become more important. That's not to say that that's the protocol I use. I'm just saying that is, if you were trying to inch out, be absolutely completely on top of your game as soon as possible, or be as recovered as possible for that next session, it's probably a good idea, So again, you have to look at, like, when someone gives you this information, like, who are they talking to? What background do they have? And, how does that actually play out in regards to your actual situation, right? But just to kind of bring it back and put this in a nice little wrapped up bow, and then we'll get on to intermittent fasting, is realistically, calorie distribution doesn't matter a huge amount, right? In a theoretical, in the sky framework, right? Like, you can have all of your calories in the morning and you can have all of your calories in the evening. You can have them nicely evenly spread, and it is irrelevant as long as they are the same number of calories, right? And assuming all the other variables are held steady. However, that assumption that all the other variables are held steady is a big assumption to make, because the way you portion out your calories is potentially going to influence all those other variables, such as, hunger, satiety, your daily activity levels. Like, maybe you do have a big breakfast and you're like, I feel more energetic, you move around more, that kind of stuff. So again, in a tracking world where you're tracking your calories, yeah, cool. If you just track your calories and you hit the same calories, and one day you have them all or the vast majority of it in the morning time, and then the other day you have it in the evening time, once you're tracking your calories, it's irrelevant, right? Because you're holding all those variables steady. And yeah, you might find my energy level is a bit down or whatever, but you're doing stuff like, I'm tracking my steps as well. I'm getting my 10,000 steps per day as a standard. You're doing all the stuff to take care of all these other variables, right? But trying to move that information onto a general population, free living individuals, you have to be a little bit more concerned with the timing, the portioning of those calories throughout the day, because that is actually going to influence, general activity levels. If they're not tracking their daily steps, again, you have to look at how the way you portion out those calories throughout the day influences that, right? And then also, again, it's like, you feel hungry or you feel more satiated, whatever, that's going to influence how many calories you eat overall if you're not tracking your calories. Again, like I said, if you have a bigger breakfast, perhaps that means that you're not going to reach for something at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, whatever it is, and all of a sudden you're eating 500, 700 extra calories just from biscuits. So again, if we're talking about a free living individual, like, calorie timing does actually become more important, even though you would kind of think of it the opposite way. If you're like, I'm tracking my calories, I'm being very on point with it, you would think that you would then be more on point with your calorie timing, but it's kind of the opposite, where if you're not tracking your calories, you're not holding that variable steady, you do need to be a little bit more aware of your calorie distribution throughout the day, because that does influence the total calories you eat if you're just not tracking. So that is something to be aware of. Again, what population are we talking to? Who are we talking to? And, how does that fit in with your actual life, your actual protocols and practices that you engage in, right? And then on the protein side of things, that is another layer to that argument. And again, from a health, body composition, performance, whatever you want to call it, any of those goals, we do probably want to have a pretty even distribution of protein throughout the day. And we can call that 3 to 4 servings of protein per day. And again, that's irregardless of if you are tracking your calories or not tracking your calories, right? We still do want to have a relatively good spread of that protein throughout the day. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have it first thing in the morning and last thing at night. You need to have like, oh, I'm awake for 16 hours. I need to kind of bookend and have protein feedings throughout the day. That's not the case. What you do need to do, though, is spread it out to some extent so that you are getting a relatively okay spread of protein throughout the day. And again, not bunching it all together, like I said earlier on, at like 6, 7, 8, because there is a refractory period to some of the signaling processes that we want from protein, So yeah, spread your protein out throughout the day. And that is a good general practice.
Yep, 100%. So, in line with what you said, I agree on all the above, with the only caveat that in terms of independent of exercise, and we talk about calorie distribution and calorie timing, they are kind of intrinsically linked with intermittent fasting, which is basically what we're going to move on to now. And is there the case that all calorie distributions are the same once calories are basically held consistent? I think probably for body composition. I think probably not for health. I do think there are some distributions that are potentially favorable, but we're probably going to talk about that more in the next podcast as it relates to chrononutrition. But kind of moving on to fasting in general, I think one of the things that you need to be aware of when talking about fasting and engaging with people who discuss the research about fasting is that there's basically there's the terminology that's used between different papers varies pretty significantly and has become more consistent, I think. But if you were to read a paper, like there's papers from like the 90s, the early 2000s even, and you'll read this paper as an intermittent fasting protocol, whereas it's basically just a means of reducing calories in the way that me or you would discuss it. So it could be that they called it intermittent fasting, but it was actually just they ate a 500 calorie deficit a few times per week. Okay. So the thing that's important to get there is that, all right, when you're talking about research outcomes, it's very important to discuss, all right, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about like time restricted feeding, where it's very clear that there's a feeding window that we're talking about in an intermittent fasting context? Or are we talking about alternate day fasting, where we're talking about 0 calories every second day, or a 5-2 distribution where 2 days are fasting, 5 days are eating ad libitum, or an isocaloric diet or whatever? So there are these different means of discussing this from a research perspective, and this is something that does get a lot of discussion in maybe some of the more, I'm not going to call it pseudoscience, but the part of the nutrition, fitness, health industry that maybe runs away a bit quickly with mechanistic research. Okay, so like for example, people will see research on rats or mice or Drosophila or worms or anything, and they'll basically totally extrapolate from that and assume that it matters in humans, despite different lifespans. So the relative difference between the time in one animal is totally different to the time in another. Differences in how we respond in terms of thermogenesis in response to feeding, etc. So there are differences between humans and some other animals that are studied, and sometimes it can seem like these things are hugely promising, but you do have to wait for some human data. So yeah, people do get a little bit excited and kind of run away with mechanistic reasons, and sometimes that's without the control of just continuous energy restriction. So one of the things that you'll see a lot of the more evidence-based people say is that it's all just the same as continuous calorie restriction. Fasting doesn't matter. I'm not that confident that is the case. Like at this point in time, you probably don't have that much evidence to suggest that, or to inform you of exactly whether or not there are independent benefits of more prolonged periods of fasting. Like it's not completely clear. Like is there a difference between me achieving the same calorie deficit through say 5 days of 0 food and me achieving the same energy deficit with just kind of continuous small energy restriction. Like, I don't think you can come down hard and say exactly what that difference is. But I mean, like, step one, from a kind of a prior estimate, if you were to think about, right, we as humans, in terms of like how we evolved in feasting and fasting cycles and the way our physiology has basically evolved in line with that, I think like you could make a sound estimate and say, look, there's probably something of benefit to potentially spending some periods without food, because it is different when you, let's say, between a continuous energy deficit and a prolonged fasting period, in that you actually have a significant difference in how your metabolism actually works. In that, once you deplete your liver glycogen and you start to oxidize more fatty acids, you start to produce ketones. And at this point in time, I don't think you can be an evidence-based person and say that none of that matters at all. Like, I think that is a prime example of what I said at the start, where you just put a negative sign in front of the people you disagree with and assume that you're now correct. So I don't think that's a good stance to hold. There is some evidence in terms of like prolonged fasting being more beneficial for things like glycemic control. So your ability to regulate your blood glucose, your insulin sensitivity, and things like that. That's in populations who have problems with those issues in general. So more insulin resistant or type 2 diabetics, it does seem like that might be a promising intervention in those cases. And that's even when you're looking at the difference between prolonged fasting and people who are achieving an energy deficit. So you do have continuous energy restriction. So there is some evidence related to that. There's some evidence to say that it might even be different in healthy people, prolonged fasting or this kind of time restricted feeding type setup, particularly early time restricted feeding, where more of the energy is distributed early in the day and the fasting window is cut off in the evening, as opposed to it being, say, the opposite way around, or just continuous energy restriction from over a 12-hour period versus an 8-hour period. So point there being that we have evidence to say that these things are probably not the exact same. But the difficult part is that you can't come down hard in any one area and say that, oh yeah, fasting is, the secret and this is what we're missing, because, it could be just the case that someone is going to get the vast majority of the benefits from just continuous energy restriction and there might be nothing else to it. But coming back to what we discussed earlier, the important thing to realize is that when we're talking about fasting, we have to consider how this intervention relates to people who are not tracking. Because again, it's not just good enough to say, there's no benefit to fasting. People who do these 24, 36-hour fasts, they're just wasting their time, because you could just do continuous calorie tracking, So it could be the case that for someone who just doesn't want to have to think about their nutrition too much, and you say to them, don't eat on Sundays, that's your one nutrition rule, that could be enough for them to achieve a small energy deficit across the week. Again, I'm not saying that that's the case for everyone, because it could be the case that leads to total overcompensation. And you do see this and have seen this as trends in the fitness industry over the last 10 years, where when intermittent fasting started to kind of merge with the IIFYM, the If It Fits Your Macros crowd, basically what people did was establish terrible eating behaviors where they would fast all day and then binge on a load of junk at night, So that's not what you want to encourage. And in that case, it's very easy to overcompensate and just basically end up negating any benefits of that fasting window. So in the case that we're talking about free living individuals, I think the introduction of certain guidelines relating to fasting could potentially be helpful, just to reduce their energy intake spontaneously, even if we set the potential supplementary benefits of fasting that might exist aside. So you do have to consider how it relates to the individual's behavior, because it's much easier, if you can get someone to stick to it, to say to someone, especially someone who's not that interested in nutrition, hey mom, don't eat on Sundays. That's your one nutrition rule. Nothing else for the moment. Okay, all right, I can try that. Some people do it as part of their, their religion already. In some cultures, fasting is built in. So that could be a very simple nutrition rule for that individual, as opposed to saying, mom, I want you to track all your calories, weigh all your meals throughout the week, and then calculate a 500 calorie deficit or 300 calorie deficit across the week. You know, the thing is, it's always fine for people like us trainers and other people who are in the game to just say, why don't you just track your calories? It's the same thing. Whereas how that relates to free living individuals is a little bit different, you know. So again, I'm not selling it as being a solution that is going to be easier for people, because it's going to be harder for some people. Like some people are going to say, you want me to not eat for 36 hours? Are you serious? You know? So it just depends on who you are and what works.
Yeah, and it's probably even easier to see the one where it's like the intervention is like the classical, we'll call it 16-8 intermittent fasting,
Yeah.
where it's like you just have an 8-hour eating window, you know, and you're like, all right, I only want you to eat between 12 and 8 p.m. Right? That's your eating window. Nothing else out there. You basically just skip breakfast. Although I hate when people say they skip breakfast, because breakfast literally means you break the fast. Like I hate what's your man James Smith always gets people, he fucking puts it out all, I think it's James Smith, always puts it out, he's like, oh, stop calling it intermittent fasting, you just skip breakfast. Which that sounds all great and everything, but you physically cannot skip breakfast, because you have to break the fast. That's the first meal of the day. Like the name of the meal is not dictated by when you eat it, it's dictated by the actual meal itself, you know. So you cannot skip breakfast.
Well, he's the prime example of someone who just puts negative in front of everything and assumes that he knows what he's talking about. So I wouldn't pay too much attention.
But anyway, look, if he's going to be semantic and be like, oh, you cannot, it's just called skipping breakfast, you physically can't skip breakfast. Anyway, that's irrelevant to this conversation. But if it is the case where you're just like, all right, you're going to skip that first meal, you're going to push that back until 12, and you're just going to have a shorter feeding window. Like that's for someone to be like, okay, cool, I just eat less then because I've just dropped out one meal from my day. And maybe you do, overcompensate a little bit and eat more at your quote unquote lunch and dinner. You maybe eat a little bit more because you're a little bit hungrier, but maybe it's enough that it's not reducing the calorie deficit too much, you know. So that could be a very easy intervention. But just pedaling back a little bit, when you were just talking about people like to kind of sell all of these things for fasting protocols, right? Or people look to go back in history and be like, oh, like we humans evolved through like feed and famine cycles and all that sort of stuff. But they only ever focus on the positive side of things, right? They only ever go like, oh, here's the health and longevity benefits. Oh, here's the whatever cognitive benefits. But just think of it. These feed and famine cycles, that's cool. We went through that, but you know, a certain percentage of the population died every single time we went through that, you know? So like, do we just ignore that and be like, oh, like, yeah, like, of course there's obviously going to be individuals that die when they do this. Let's just ignore that. Or the fact that, you know, the large percentage of the population was effectively functionally infertile during those famine cycles, you know, where like, especially, you know, women are a little bit more prone to this, where, you know, you literally see it. Well, I'm not gonna say they're more prone to it. It's actually that's incorrect, but it's more easily seen, where, you know, women just lose their menstrual cycle. They're just not, they're not a free cycling female anymore, you know, where, because they're in such an energy deficit, you know, there's no free energy available. So they're like, all right, let's set off or reduce this reproductive function, you know, let's not put calories towards that, because we don't have calories to go towards that. So why aren't people selling that as well, being like, oh yeah, your fasting protocol, you know, causes functional infertility? You know, no one says that and being like, oh, that's a great idea. They're like, oh, you know, your fasting protocol increases your cognitive health and your lifespan and all that sort of stuff. It's like, you can't just pick and choose what you want from a protocol. Like, the protocol is the protocol. It results in these adaptations. You can't just ignore them, you know? And yeah, there probably is some transient benefits for short term that you gain without dipping into any of the negatives. But you have to clearly define where that point is, because if you're giving information to everyone, you know, there's going to be people in there that go, oh, this person said like a 2-day fast per week is a good idea. You know what? I'm actually going to do 2 weeks out of every 5 of fasting, you know? I'm going to just, you know, take it up a level, you know? But so there's going to be people that take it to extremes And you have to factor that in when you are giving information, or at least, caveat it and be like, this is the protocol. These are the adaptations that you get. Don't do more than this or whatever. You have to explain that to individuals, because people will always take it to the nth degree. They'll be like, how far can I push? Can I fast for 90 days? People do that shit, and it's like, all right, I thought that was a hunger strike. Like, that's basically what that is. People die doing that shit, so you have to be a lot more clear in what you're actually trying to achieve with any of these things, but just going back to the actual, we'll call it the 16-8 style intermittent fasting. Again, there's a huge difference between, giving that as a protocol to someone that is tracking calories versus giving that as a protocol to someone that is free living. Because in the free living individual, like, you could see huge benefits to that, in the tracking individual, I don't think it's going to be that, life-changing of a protocol. In both individuals, it probably is going to make it a little bit easier to stick to a calorie deficit, and you might notice some cognitive benefits in the morning time, assuming you skip the morning meal, and you delay your first feeding until later in the day. You might notice some cognitive benefits because you're not thinking about food. It's just, you don't have that, we'll call it 30 minutes of eating and preparing food, whatever. You don't have that interruption, and you don't have like the maybe, post-digestive kind of like, oh, I feel a little bit, relaxed and all that kind of stuff. And maybe you can be a little bit more sympathetically driven in terms of your nervous system output. You can be like, drink a coffee, you're a little bit more hyped up, and you can stay that way because you're not in that kind of post-absorptive state, kind of rest and digest type thing. So, you can feel like, oh, I'm way more energetic in the mornings, but it's just because, your nervous system is like, oh man, I need to get food. Like, I need to hype this individual up so that, I can get through this. And again, like, you think of like you're still mobilizing energy from the body somewhere when you're in that kind of state, because that happens pretty much every night. So, your cortisol levels are a little bit higher. So to mobilize the fuel, and that can make you feel a little bit, oh, I'm a bit more like wired, a little bit more turned on, especially if you do bring in some like caffeine during that restriction period. That can really be like, oh, I don't have anything to buffer this caffeine digestion, so I feel that a little bit more. And you're already in a nervous system state where it's like, okay, I'm a little bit more hyped up anyway, So you have to factor all those things in, because that's generally the protocol people bring in, where they're like, oh, I have like a restricted feeding window, and then in the morning time when I'm not eating, I do have like 2 or 3 coffees to kind of give me that boost in energy. And it's like, those coffees are probably more, we'll call it, effective in the morning time when you're not eating, so it is like, we have to actually really dive into who are we talking to when we talk about an intermittent fasting protocol, because the actual outcomes of it are different. If we're talking about someone who's tracking and we're talking about someone who is not tracking, like, they are completely different. Again, reading the research or reading the protocols people put out online, it's like you're taking the results from one population and then making it out as if it applies to this other population. Like, again, you take the results that someone got in a free living population and then going, right, my intermittent fasting protocol with tracking is going to be even better. And it's like, that's, there might be some, again, like you said, like better glycemic control, or there might be some of these, potential benefits, but it's hard to tell if you wouldn't have just got those benefits by getting leaner overall. Like, you wouldn't have got like some better insulin sensitivity and better glycemic control just by losing body fat over a continuous caloric deficit without intermittent fasting over 20 weeks. And we can't tell at this stage. We don't know, but again, we also don't know if there's potential long-term negative benefits to intermittent fasting protocols. Like, we can't just look at the positives and be like, oh, there probably is some, you get some more liver depletion or more muscle glycogen depletion when you are in these intermittent fasting states, and maybe that has some benefits, or maybe you get some more ketone production and maybe that has some benefits, or whatever it is. We can't also ignore that there's potentially negatives with that as well. Like, that's just as possible as there are positives, and there's always this kind of bias in research with nutritional stuff as well, where we kind of just always look for the positives in things. Be like, what does this nutrient do in terms of the positives? And it's only after we establish that we go, all right, now let's start looking at the negatives, being like, oh, there's actually this is a toxicity level thing, like, so you have to look at that with the research on intermittent fasting, or even the protocols with intermittent fasting. Like, this is a relatively new practice in terms of the nutritional side of things. Like, yes, there are religious, spiritual, and whatever type of practices, but no one was studying those long term. They're being like, what are the health benefits? Like, I know we do have a lot of research on, say, like Muslims engaging in Ramadan, like the differences in their like blood lipids and glycemic control and all that kind of stuff. But again, they're free living individuals. They're not tracking their calories. So again, if you're a different population to that, you have to take that into account. And also, you can't just ignore that there are potentially actual population changes. Like, I always use the Eskimos as an example. Like, people use, I don't know if that's a racist term. I don't know what we're supposed to call them. Inuits, maybe. I don't know. But the native people to the northern regions, but like those individuals, like, people always like to use them when they're discussing the benefits of a ketogenic diet. But those individuals have adaptations that allow them to not get ketoacidosis. Like, all the people that got ketoacidosis died. So there's been a selective pressure for individuals that just don't get this acidosis, so they could eat a completely ketogenic diet and not have any negative effects, because they have these different enzymes. They have this different ability to metabolize this, So there's been a selective pressure over thousands of years. So if you look at a population and you go, oh, well, there's been this selective pressure over thousands of years, they probably have this different adaptations to this protocol. You can't just automatically then translate that into a different population, so that does have to be taken into account when you do discuss this. Like, you have to be very specific in terms of what you are discussing, right? Then on the intermittent fasting side of things as well, we have to look at protein, right? So we're just after saying earlier on that there is a benefit potentially from just having a relatively even distribution of protein throughout the day, from a cognitive perspective, satiety perspective, muscle perspective. How do we align that with this intermittent fasting protocol that we bring in, where we're either doing like a few hours not eating in the morning, that's the general practice, versus, or even like not eating for 2 days per week, because they're probably the two most used protocols. The 5-2 protocol, where people just don't eat 2 days per week. They don't have to be the same day after day, 2 days. They can be like Wednesday and a Sunday or whatever, or the 8-16 type deal, where you're just only have a feeding window of 8 hours and you're not eating for 16 hours, which is basically the opposite of what most people do. They sleep for 8 hours, or relatively, and then they eat for 16 hours. So regardless, unless you are waking up in the middle of the night to eat, you are engaging in some fasting every day. Just putting it out there as a caveat. Right. Anyway, go
on. Yeah. So personally, like, when I think about trying to reconcile the protein thing with the intermittent fasting, I view it as a trade-off. Okay. I don't think, like, while I would probably put myself maybe slightly in favor of thinking that there's probably, that I'd be fairly pro fasting. I think there's something to fasting. I think it's a fairly sound protocol, especially because I do eat in a more free living manner and don't track my calories. So as a result, I have that bias towards, like, okay, what actually works, in the real world when people aren't tracking. And I think fasting can be useful. But with that said, if I was a bodybuilder trying to maximize every last inch of muscle mass, I would not probably be engaging in prolonged periods of fasting very often. It just goes against pretty much what we have been discussing. And I don't think that in this case there's a theoretical mechanism that we could propose that would really, justify it being superior for muscle building. So I don't think it's superior for muscle building by any means. I think that you might have to accept some sort of trade-off, and that trade-off would increase the more that you increase the duration or frequency, you could say, of your fasting. So I think if you're talking about something like let's say a 12-12, which is very reasonable. Like, I mean, that's normal. That should be kind of what you're eating anyway. If you're talking about like a 12-hour fasting period, 12-hour eating window, Does that make much of a difference? No, probably not. I wouldn't be writing home about that. I don't think there's much of a reason to be concerned about that. Even in research where I think I'm almost certain there's at least one, if not multiple, 16/8 fasting studies on muscle building or muscle retention. And once overall protein is taken care of and resistance training is adequate, like it doesn't make that much of a difference. So it's not something you need to sweat too much. But again, it depends where your priorities lie, because like if you're considering like 1%, 2%, 3% changes over years to be like very significant, then one, that's not going to be taken care of in a 6 to 12 week resistance training study. It won't be measured. So you have to ask yourself, like, are you willing to basically engage in nutrition protocols that you don't have evidence for because they're not going to be measured within a particular study? And if I was a bodybuilder and that was my thing and that was my main goal, or if you had asked 18-year-old Gary, like you do everything to get every last percent, because like that's what kind of what bodybuilding is about, or
And
any
that's
athletic
how you got
endeavor.
up to 180 kilos. So
That's how I got here, yeah. but that's the case with any athletic endeavor. So in that case, you're thinking, okay, well, I'm going to do it because there might be something there, even if I don't know what's there. So that's the way I would reconcile it. I would say that, look, it's probably not the best to be engaging in prolonged fasting if you are considering maximizing every last bit of muscle. I think if you're engaging in multiple 24-hour fasts, like 2 days of complete fasting per week, I think you might have to accept a bit of a trade-off, especially if you're training on those days. But I think overall for most people, I think if it's helping your dietary adherence and that's what's keeping you on track, like it's probably worth it. The only thing I would say is that you can do things in your favor to make sure that that trade-off is as small as possible. So for example, don't make your fasting day the same day as your hardest lower body training day. Common sense, right? If you're going to have a fasting day, make it a rest day. I typically, when I'm advising people, I generally say, look, if you're going to have a fasting day, pick a really busy day of work or something like that your mind is occupied the whole time. And a lot of the time, maybe 60-70%, people are like, yeah, that actually suits me because I don't think about food much at work. Whereas others, they're like, no, food, that when I'm busiest at work, that's when I need my food. That's when I need, especially like manual labor or something. And that's when you need to be well fed. So it does depend on who you are. Like personally, I like a more prolonged fasting period on like today on a Sunday, because it just kind of suits me. Like sometimes that's not the case, but a lot of the time it just suits me. Get up, because I generally eat a bit more on a Saturday anyway. So on a Sunday for me, I'm like, yeah, right, get up. I'll have a coffee or whatever. We do the podcast. Then it's 11 or 12. Might do a bit of work, might go for a walk, might go for a run, come back, do a bit of study. And then I'll have, my dinner 5 or 6 o'clock and maybe an extra bit of protein to top up on protein. But it's some means of introducing fasting, sometimes 24 hours, sometimes not. But yeah, that would be my perspective on the protein thing. I think there's a trade-off there. I think you can do things to minimize it. And I think if you're thinking about everything in terms of maximizing muscle building, there's going to be some trade-off there in terms of things that might even benefit your health. You might be the case that you actually have to have massive meals right before bed that sometimes compromise your sleep. And that's kind of the nature of extremes, really.
yeah, like I always think of it like, again, it just comes down to this argument where people always just focus on the positives, but they're focusing on the positives of a fasting protocol being like, oh, it helps with health, and all of those are pretty much mediated through like the AMPK pathway, if you want to really just refine it down to that. Which, like, I'm not going to say all of the benefits, that's probably incorrect, but a lot of the benefits are through this AMPK pathway. And we can call this a kind of a fat loss pathway, if you will. So they get those through this kind of fat loss stuff, but also that does occur when you are just reducing calories overall. So I don't think anyone would argue that the best environment for building muscle is one where you have reduced calories. I don't think someone's going to say that that's the best environment, right? So why would you then say, okay, a hormonal signaling cellular environment, whatever you want to call it, where we are tapping into those same pathways that result in fat loss, why would you think that that's going to be the best for muscle gain? It's probably not, right? However, that doesn't mean that if you fast, you're going to lose bucket loads of muscle. I do think that there are like that thought process of, oh, if I'm not in a continuous positive nitrogen state, I'm just going to lose so much muscle. Like if you genuinely think that, then man, you must be fucking scared all the time. Like what? Like you go 3, 4, 5 hours without a meal, like all of a sudden you're like, fucking lost 100 grams of muscle. Like if you're losing that much muscle that quickly, like you probably didn't own that muscle to begin with. Like like it's just not a concern in my mind, right? However, again, I don't think that you'd be able to easily argue that prolonged fasting is a good or beneficial strategy for building excessive levels of muscle, we'll call it that. But I don't think that it's detrimental to maintaining a high degree of muscle mass. Like I just don't see how that would be the case. I don't see why your body would preferentially target muscle rather than its preferred fuel sources. Like why would it go, oh, I know we have some glucose freely available here, I know we have some glycogen that we could tap into, I know we have some fatty acids, but you know what, I'm actually just going to bypass those two things and tap into muscle. That's all I want, really. Like that's not what your body wants to do. Now that might be more of a concern if you are, I don't know, fucking 5% body fat, that, and you're like, all right, cool. Like it's very likely that, you don't have a lot of excess fat to use. Maybe your liver glycogen hasn't been topped up in fucking 16 weeks because you've been getting shredded, and your overall calories are low, then maybe you might start tapping into some muscle mass. So when you do get to those really, really lean levels, then there probably is a point where you want to be a lot more focused on having a positive nitrogen balance as long throughout the day as you possibly can. Like you want to be ensuring that signal to retain that muscle is there multiple times throughout the day, right? So again, it depends on the exact nature of where that individual is, and obviously goes without saying, if you are using something like, I don't know, insulin, then this probably is a lot more important to really dial in on. So if you are a bodybuilder and you're on fucking, a few IUs of insulin, or even growth hormone, there probably are, even testosterone as well, there are interactions here that we need to look into a little bit deeper and then realize that, maybe this isn't the best protocol to be using. But obviously that's a discussion for a whole other industry. Yeah, is there anything else you want to cover on the intermittent fasting side of things? Actually, just before we kind of just wrap that up, I'd just like to say that I do actually intermittent fast myself. So I actually have the bias that I actually enjoy intermittent fasting. Like my day basically goes morning time, wake up, do all my triage work. Like I said it before, when the one where we're discussing about what we do with college at the moment. Yeah, I'm basically wake up in the morning and I just don't focus on food, don't think about food until after I do my resistance training, which is around 12 o'clock, So we'll say my first meal of the day is 1, 2, that kind of time frame, accounting for, cooking time and all of that jazz. So I'm doing an hour of resistance training, cook my food straight after, eat my food, and then I eat another time later in the day, we'll say 5 o'clock, and then I would normally, if, the country wasn't closed down, would normally do jiu-jitsu at, we'll say 7 to 9, like 2 hours of jiu-jitsu. And then after that, I would have my last meal of the day, which would, maybe be some oats and whey or something like that, So that means that I'm fasting into my first training session, but like, it's not for me, like that's not my most important training session. Like I kind of prefer being fasted with that session. I just feel a little bit better. But also realize that I have also eaten sufficient calories throughout the day previously. Like I've eaten a big bowl of oats after the jiu-jitsu. And while I have obviously tapped into that to some extent in the morning, I'm also just not that active from like whatever time I wake up, 6 a.m. till 12. I've literally done maybe 400 steps most days, by that stage, because I'm literally just sitting at my computer doing the work that needs to be done. So I'm just not active. So I'm not burning through grams of fucking calories. So coming into my session, I'm well fed. If I was, way more active, then I probably would eat before that session. But for me, I feel good. Go do the session. It's not that demanding. Like, it's an hour session. It's not like it's 2 hours of, ridiculously heavy lifting. The weights I lift might be heavier than what someone else lifts, relatively speaking, but it's not like I'm pushing the boundaries of human physical performance here, so I don't need to be as 100% micromanaging the minutiae of the diet, and it's just a protocol that works for me. And that's what I do most days, even the days, because I only do 4 resistance training sessions and then 4 jiu-jitsu sessions, sometimes 5. And then on the Wednesday, which I have off, I still fast that day. And then my first meal is like 1:00. Same again on the Saturday. I might do a jiu-jitsu session, 2 hours of jiu-jitsu, again, depending on how beat up I am from the week, depending on how much college work I have had to do, depending on how much triage work I got done or didn't get done throughout the week. I might do 2 hour, because there's an open mat and stuff. And I like to see how good I'm getting on that day. But I don't eat before that. That's usually 10 to 12. So again, I come out at 12 o'clock and have my first meal after that. Same again as Gary on the Sunday. That's when we record the podcast. That's what day it is today when we're recording this. And same again, we generally record the podcast. We do an hour meeting rundown of, emotional feedback to each other. We just talk through our feelings, how much we love each other, all that stuff. Sometimes we talk about how business stuff that we need to talk about. It's rare that we talk about that. It's more about the feelings, and then we just record the podcast. And then again, that's generally, we end up around the kind of 11, 12 mark. And that's when I buy my food for the week. So I'll walk down, I'll do a little bit of exercise, get some steps in, walk down to the shops. Nowadays, because my local shop is Dundrum Town Centre, so there's hundreds of people that go there. I generally have to wait to get into the shop. There's a huge queue outside. So that's what my day looks like on a Sunday nowadays. And then after that, I eat my first meal. So every single one of those days, I've fasted for at least 16 hours, right? So I have a pro in intermittent fasting bias for my own schedule, my own, whatever you want to call it. However, I also would struggle with that if I was really trying to gain weight. I probably wouldn't struggle because I'd probably just drink calories to do it. But if I had to get in 5,000, 6,000 calories to gain weight, then I'm eating like 3,000 calories right now, and it's a slight deficit for me, and I weigh 100 kilos. So relatively speaking, that is a deficit for me, and given my 10,000 steps per day and my rough 2 sessions per day. But if I was trying to gain and I was having to really push those calories up, because I do have a bit of an adaptive metabolism where I just start getting warmer and warmer and fucking depleting all those calories that I eat, I probably would start bringing in something like a breakfast. Even though, again, it's not breakfast. You eat breakfast every day regardless. But like something like a morning feeding, just purely so that I could get more calories in. So again, it changes, depends on the exact situation, depends on the individual, depends on all of those kind of things.
Yeah, 100%. And the only thing I would actually add, as in one of a personal thing and a philosophical thing, and something you don't necessarily have to agree with, is that I think that if you are the type of person that you freak out every time you get a little bit hungry and you need to eat immediately and you can't deal without food and stuff, I just think that's pretty weak, unless you have a disease that necessitates that sort of response. So I mean, it's a genuine goal, as in if you don't want to be that person and you want to feel if I'm ever in a situation where I don't have food for 12 hours or 24 hours or 36 hours, if you want to be the person that's I'm going to be cool in that situation, I'm prepared for that, I've trained for that, then that is actually another genuine benefit. And personally, I would feel really uncomfortable with the idea that, if I don't eat for 3 hours, I start to get anxious and feel oh no, I can't do anything. Because some bodybuilders are like that, man. Some bodybuilders will not train if they haven't eaten for 3 hours, and not just out of oh no, it's just not optimal, so I'll train later, but because oh no, you can't train if you haven't eaten. So in general, I think it's a pretty sound practice to get used to being without food as well, because minimizing the amount of crutches you need to live your life is fairly sound in general. So yeah, that's the
Are you
only thing.
basically saying that if people don't have hardship in their life, they should search out hardships? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly it.
Oh, I can't wait to get my cat of nine tails and just start fucking flagellating myself and being like, I have no hardships in my life. Gary said I have to do this.
Unreal. That's what you need.
No, it's not.
But yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. So if you've already nailed all that stuff, like you can go without food for, I think, like for me, 6 months is the sweet spot. 6 months without food.
That's because you're 180 kilos shredded. Like,
yeah, it's got a lot of muscle to eat up, and so I'm looking a bit skinny at the moment. Few weeks or few months without any sleep, that's when I generally start to take out the sword and just start smacking myself in the back or whatever.
that would be a terrible idea with a sword, Gary. But anyway, look, I understand that you don't understand history. That's fine. But anyway, the next thing, the final thing that we want to touch on is the idea of chrononutrition, which is effectively what we have been discussing, right? But it's actually different than what we have been discussing as well, right? And chrono meaning effectively time, chronos, you know yourself. You know your Greek history, Gary. Who's Chronos?
Of course. What?
What's Chronos mean?
Time. You just said.
Interesting. Do you know your Greek history?
I don't know. I don't know my Irish history. No, I do. I know my Greek history very, very vaguely.
That's disgusting. Anyway, look, I'm not going to explain it to you. You can go search that up on your own time. But anyway, look.
This is what Paddy always says, though. He introduces something real vague, pretends he understands it, and then moves on.
That's not what I do. I introduce something really vague just to troll you, and then you go, fucking fuck. And then you go search it up yourself, and then you go, Jesus, that Patrick fella, he actually knows what he's talking about. But anyway, look, that's irrelevant to this conversation. Chrononutrition, again, it is the temporal domain to nutrition, and there is a lot more than what we are discussing here, but it mainly pertains to free living individuals who are not tracking their calories. Like there's actually so many interesting, we'll call them signaling events that occur both from like the stomach perspective, from the digestive tract perspective, from like the liver perspective, that occur in response to how you actually time your calories and how you actually distribute them throughout the day, right? But while we both could record an episode on that, I'd rather just get an expert on. So that's probably what we're going to do. That might be the next episode. It might not. We'll see what the crack is. But you may see this discussed and you might be like, how does this fit into what we just discussed here in terms of, like, we just talked about the temporal domain to, calorie distribution throughout the day, the temporal domain to nutrition, if you want to call it like that, right? Which is effectively chrononutrition, right? But we've just said that it kind of doesn't matter, right? But you'll read all this, or maybe read someone's interpretation of the research, and all of a sudden they start going on about how much this actually matters, right? Like how much of a difference. They're like, oh, someone had more calories at breakfast and someone had more calories at like dinner, and that resulted in two completely different outcomes. One of them lost weight and one of them gained weight. You might be like, oh fuck, so if I eat calories in the evening, that means I'm more likely to gain weight. But again, we have to caveat that generally with the point that they are in free living, free eating humans. They're not tracking their calories, so calories are not the same. However, there is also research on isocaloric diets that do note differences, right? So again, rather than diving in deep here in this episode, we're going to get an expert on, but I do want to have it in your mind that there is potential benefits, potential negatives in how you actually distribute your calories throughout the day, right? And this is both we'll call it a genetic thing, but also a preference thing. Again, we discussed on some of the issues that occur, like the satiety, how hungry, and all that kind of stuff that you feel throughout the day, which might then change the amount of calories you eat. But there are some other things that go on, especially in like the level of the liver, for example, that maybe you do have a genetic predisposition to certain liver diseases, and maybe some actual timing protocols make more sense for you, even if they aren't perfectly aligned with your preferences, so there is more to the discussion, right? However, if you are looking to just change your body composition, improve your performance, and improve your health overall as a general point, your calorie distribution doesn't matter once calories are controlled for. Like you're going to get, if you look at it from a magnitude of effect type deal, like having your calories at an appropriate level, that's going to get you 90, 95, 98% of the benefits. Like if you have excess body fat to lose, then losing that body fat is going to result in better health. You know what I mean? So having that perspective of I just need to get a protocol that allows me to lose that excess body fat, then you're going to get better health as a result. You know what I mean? So it doesn't matter what protocol you actually use, you're going to see the benefits from that, obviously up to a point. I'm not saying that, you have to lose all your body fat completely and that's what leads to health. I'm just saying if you are in a body fat distribution bracket that, this is an at-risk category for X, Y, and Z diseases, then, bringing in a protocol that leads to fat loss is probably a good idea. And you're going to see health benefits from that, so that's what I'd like to caveat the chrononutrition discussion with.
Absolutely. And as you said, no need to dig in any deeper to that for the moment, because we will be discussing it probably on next Monday's podcast, most likely, depending on the guest's availability. And if not, it'll be the Monday after. So yeah, that's it really. If you're interested in following along with us, learning more about our work and reading more, watching more interesting videos, etc., best place to get involved is to first start by subscribing to the Triage Method newsletter, and you can find that linked in the description box below. So that includes the content that we've posted and produced, published, etc., as well as recommended resources from around the internet and an exclusive post/article in each email that you'll probably find interesting. As well as that, you can join the Triage Method community. So that's the best place to keep in touch with us in terms of asking questions and giving suggestions as to what we discuss in the podcast or our YouTube channel, etc. But you can also, if you'd like to submit a question anonymously that's not in the Facebook group, there's a question form below in the description box as well. Otherwise, if you're interested in online coaching, we do have one-to-one and group options available. And that's with myself, Paddy, or Lee in the one-to-one coaching. And then when it comes to the group coaching, we've got male and female options available. And for the ladies, Breed Long leads the ladies group coaching. So she obviously, understands all of your needs better than us. And she's doing a fantastic job of providing recipes and supporting the ladies that are in their training pursuits. As well as that, you can get involved with our ebooks. So there's program templates and there's the beginner's guidebook. And now is a good time to get involved with those, upskill a little bit, have some training program ideas, understand the basics of training and nutrition. And then if you want to follow along with our actual social media, of course, you can follow on Instagram, Triage Method, Skinny Gaz, or The Real Paddy Farrell. Not that active, but hey, get involved. Twitter as well, Triage Method, Facebook, Triage Method, and YouTube, Triage Method. If you were to pick one, I'd subscribe to YouTube, and you can get involved with the Facebook group anyway, and keep in touch with us and keep up to date with all the content, as well as the newsletter, of course.
100%. You're a good boy, Gary. I've nothing else to add. So I'll talk to everyone again. If they're not in the Facebook group, because we're active in the Facebook group all the time, but if you're not in there, or you're not, subscribed to our YouTube or whatever, we will talk to you again on Thursday when you listen to this again. Peace out.